We often think about conflict in terms of, well, things we can see, right? Armies, weapons.
Tangible thing.
Exactly. But what if there's another kind of struggle happening? Sort of unseen. One source calls it a battle in the shadows of lostness.
That's a powerful phrase.
It is. And it's not fought with force, but it's about belief, compassion, purpose, really.
This is a fascinating idea, isn't it? This silent war. The source suggests spiritual neglect, this absence of something vital for the spirit, is actually a really potent force.
A force that shapes us.
Profoundly. Shapes individuals, shapes whole societies. It creates a kind of fundamental vulnerability.
Right. And that vulnerability, that neglect, is exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
We're pulling key insights from a battle waged in the shadows of lostness.
Good source material for this.
Definitely. We want to unpack what spiritual neglect really means, look at its consequences, which are pretty far-reaching, and sort of get why this is something we need to take seriously.
Think of this as the shortcut, maybe. Getting the core ideas without getting bogged down.
Exactly. A direct route. Now, the source makes a really key point early on. This isn't just about, someone not praying or skipping service.
No, it frames it much bigger, more systemic, like a lack of consistent nurturing for our inner lives.
A systemic failure. And this absence, it argues, shows up in really tangible ways. It hits us hard.
It really does.
Okay, so let's dig into that idea. A systemic failure causing these weaknesses within us. The source points to three main ways this neglect takes root. First up, loss of connection.
Right. And the crucial thing here is intentionality.
Meaning
the source suggests if we don't actively cultivate our spiritual side, however we define that, personally we risk losing that sense of being connected to something bigger.
Like drifting away if you don't make an effort.
Precisely. The takeaway is pretty stark. No deliberate connection leads to isolation. Feeling fragmented.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Anything important needs attention, right? So if that connection weakens, the second consequence highlighted is emotional erosion. What's that about?
Well, think about resilience, inner strength. This absence of spiritual grounding, it creates a kind of void inside.
A void.
Yeah. Where hope and that sort of inner strength should be, there's emptiness. Spiritual neglect basically leaves us emotionally vulnerable when life throws curveballs.
So less able to cope when things get tough.
Exactly. It weakens that core ability.
And it's not just us as individuals, is it? The third point is community decay. How does spiritual neglect hit the wider community?
This really broadens the picture. The source uses this powerful image withholding the light of faith.
Okay.
The key idea is when the spiritual nourishment is missing collectively, it doesn't just harm individuals, it actually weakens the social fabric itself.
How so?
Empathy starts to decline, unity frays, that shared sense of purpose, of destiny, it fades. A community needs those things to thrive, and neglect starves them.
So it's like this internal weakening, this silent siege, as the source calls it, eroding us from the inside out, both personally and collectively.
That's a good way to put it.
The text then uses another really strong metaphor, chains of spiritual bondage, suggesting millions are burdened by these invisible chains, forged simply by a lack of hope.
And it's fascinating how this unseen captivity, as it's termed, actually plays out. The source looks at internal struggles and this deep isolation.
Okay, let's start with those internal battles. What are we talking about day to day?
We're talking about relentless inner turmoil, constant fights with despair, maybe addiction, just that heavy, persistent feeling of hopelessness.
Things many people wrestle with privately.
Absolutely. And the critical point the source makes is, without the perspective, the strength that spiritual insight can offer, these battles just become endless cycles. People get trapped.
A bleak picture.
Yeah.
And then there's the isolation and suffering. How does neglect make that worse?
Well, pain is universal, right? But the source suggests that without a shared spiritual understanding, suffering becomes incredibly isolating. It cuts people off from that fundamental human search for meaning, for redemption. They feel utterly alone in struggles that actually are widely shared human experiences. It blocks connection.
Wow. Okay, so moving beyond the individual cost, the source talks about the hidden cost.
Yeah.
This spiritual bondage having a wider impact, starting with a societal deficit. What's the argument there?
The core idea is pretty significant. It argues that every life untouched by hope isn't just a personal loss, it's a loss for the entire community.
A loss of what, exactly?
A loss of potential for collective spiritual renewal. That renewal fosters compassion, shared purpose, strength. things a healthy community relies on. So when individuals are neglected spiritually, the whole community is poorer for it.
And this builds up over time, leading to collective diminishment. How does that work?
It's a cumulative effect. Widespread spiritual neglect over the long haul can erode the very foundations of a society.
Like the glue holding things together.
Exactly. Those social bonds weaken, cohesion frays, and despair finds more room to spread. It's a slow, gradual weakening, but potentially devastating.
Almost like the bedrock crumbling slowly. The source also brings in historical echoes. What lessons does history offer here?
Some pretty stark warnings, according to the text. The core lesson is that civilizations often decay from within when they abandon their spiritual and moral foundations.
So it's not just about military might or economics.
Not at all. History shows examples of empires, communities that seemed strong but crumbled because those inner foundations were neglected. Societal strength needs more than just material power.
And this isn't just something that happens and is over. It has a generational impact. How does that legacy get passed down?
That's a critical point about the long-term view. The effects aren't confined to one generation.
They echo.
They echo across generations. The source argues it creates this inherited legacy of disenchantment, loss. It becomes a burden passed down through families, through communities, and it's incredibly hard to shake off.
Wow. Okay, so the picture painted is definitely sobering, but the source doesn't just leave us there, right? It shifts towards solutions.
Thankfully, yes. It talks about bridging the divide, a call to action. Understanding the problem has to lead somewhere practical.
Right. The first area is revitalizing community spirit. What's the core approach suggested?
It comes back to that idea of intentionality, actually. Communities need to actively create shared spiritual experiences.
Like what?
Regular gatherings, maybe. Meaningful dialogues, rituals, things that foster genuine belonging and mutual support, rebuilding those connections deliberately.
And it's vital these efforts aren't exclusive, correct? The source mentions inclusive outreach.
Absolutely crucial. The principle is fundamental. Reach beyond the usual boundaries of established faith groups.
Why is that so important?
Because every single person deserves access to spiritual guidance and support, period. No matter their background, their current situation, nobody should be left out on the fringes.
Okay, shifting to the individual level now. Practical applications for personal renewal. What kind of practices does this source suggest?
It points towards introspective things, meditation, prayer, maybe reflective journaling, practices like that.
And the goal?
The core idea is creating space for individuals to reconnect with their own inner sense of purpose, of meaning, dedicated time for that internal growth.
Makes sense. And it also highlights mentorship and guidance. What role does that play?
Well, if you think about navigating away from despair, having guidance can be huge. The source suggests setting up supportive relationships.
Like experienced people helping others.
Exactly. Experienced mentors sharing wisdom insights. That guidance can be invaluable for someone feeling lost, offering a path towards hope again.
And finally, the call to action includes institutional reformation, especially for religious organizations. What are the key suggestions there?
Active evangelization comes up as critical.
So not just maintaining membership.
Right. It's about proactively engaging with the wider world, breaking those chains of neglect, planting seeds of hope, and outward focus.
And it also mentions integrating holistic support systems. But what's the thinking behind that?
It's about recognizing the complexity of need, really, combining spiritual guidance with practical help, social services, for instance.
Addressing the whole person.
Precisely. People experiencing spiritual neglect often face tangible challenges, too. A holistic approach tackles both the inner and the outer needs. It's comprehensive support.
So a really thorough look from the problem to potential solutions. Now, the source also goes deeper into why this neglect happens in the first place, the anatomy of absence. It suggests it's often subtle, not deliberate malice.
Right, more a confluence of factors.
The first one mentioned is the quiet comfort of complacency. How does comfort lead to neglect?
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Success can breed stagnation. When an institution, a church, an organization gets comfortable, stable, it can create this false sense of security.
And the result?
That initial drive, that energy for outreach, for engaging beyond their walls, it can just fade. The focus shifts inward towards just maintaining things. Routine takes over.
The source gives an example.
Yeah.
A once vibrant congregation becoming complacent. What would that actually look like?
Well, you might see priorities shift subtly. Less focus on connecting with the wider town, more on programs just for existing members.
Less outward energy.
Yeah. The passion for sharing their message might dim. Opportunities to connect with outsiders just get missed or aren't seen as important anymore. It's usually a slow drift, but the end result is a disconnect.
Okay. Another factor, the paralysis of fear. How does fear play into this?
Well, nobody likes conflict, right? Especially today. The core idea is that fear of causing offense, of being controversial, can lead to silence.
Silence on important issues.
Exactly. On vital things where spiritual perspective could really help. It seems like keeping the peace, but the source argues this silence becomes a barrier to real engagement, to sharing transformative ideas.
The example is a community avoiding tough social issues. What happens then?
Well, by trying not to rock the boat, they might end up not addressing the real messy questions people are actually grappling with.
Where guidance is needed most, perhaps.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And the consequence. The message gets watered down. People seeking honest dialogue, even on difficult stuff, might feel unheard, alienated.
Then there's the drift of theological emphasis. How can shifts in focus contribute?
This is about how a faith community's priorities can subtly change over time. For instance, a focus on social justice is vital, absolutely.
What?
But the source points out, sometimes that focus can unintentionally overshadow the personal invitation. That call to individual spiritual renewal and transformation, it's about balance.
The example is a congregation focusing only on community service, maybe neglecting personal evangelism. What's the risk there?
Service is powerful, no doubt, a great expression of faith. But if it's the only focus, the direct sharing of beliefs, that personal invitation to explore faith, that can get lost.
Creating a different kind of void.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Even within a community doing good works, if that personal dimension of faith isn't nurtured, something is missing.
Resource allocation is another piece of the puzzle. The dilemma of resource allocation. How does money and time factor in?
It's simple, really. Resources are finite. Time, money, people's energy. Institutions can get totally consumed by just running the place.
Day-to-day operation.
Exactly. Paying bills, maintaining buildings, running programs for current members. This operational overreach, the source calls it, can unintentionally suck resources away from outreach, from connecting with people outside.
The example given is a church spending big on facilities but cutting outreach. What's the real cost there?
Well, every dollar, every hour spent on internal stuff, while some is necessary, sure is a resource not available for engaging the unreached community.
An opportunity cost.
A huge one. The cost isn't just the building budget. It's measured in potential lives untouched, people who never hear a message of hope because the focus was elsewhere.
Finally, the overlooked battle. Spiritual warfare is mentioned. How does downplaying spiritual opposition contribute to neglect here?
The argument is, if you dismiss or forget the idea that there are active forces opposing spiritual well-being and truth, well, your motivation to guard against them drops.
Less urgency.
Exactly, a diminished sense of urgency. It can leave people and communities more vulnerable to despair, to moral compromise, ultimately to spiritual neglect itself.
The example is leadership dismissing this idea and then being unprepared for moral challenges. What's the danger in that?
If you don't acknowledge potential opposing forces, you can become complacent, unprepared.
Caught off guard.
Right. Lacking the discernment, the tools, the readiness to offer real guidance when moral or spiritual crises hit, you're vulnerable to things you didn't prepare for.
So it's a complex web of factors leading to this absence. The source then looks at how this manifests when institutions turn inward. The inward turn. The church as a beleaguered fortress.
A striking image.
It is. First point, insulation and complacency. The echo chamber effect. What's happening there?
It's the idea that an inward-looking community starts reinforcing its own beliefs, its own practices, without much input or challenge from outside.
Like talking only to yourselves.
Pretty much. You lose that diversity of thought. Conformity becomes more valued than critical thinking or adapting to the world outside. An echo chamber.
The analogy used is a fortress keeping out innovation. How does this lead to intellectual stagnation?
Well, like a real fortress keeps out new developments, this kind of community can shut itself off from fresh ideas, from changing cultural contexts, from challenging questions.
So growth stops.
It stifles growth, yeah. It hinders the ability to connect with the wider world in relevant ways. Things get stale.
And this inward turn can also cause decay from within the slow erosion of faith. How does that happen internally?
The focus shifts. Instead of nurturing a dynamic personal connection with the divine, the emphasis becomes just preserving the rituals, going through the motions.
Losing the spark.
Exactly. Personal encounters become rote. The vitality drains away. It becomes more about maintaining the outward form than living the faith.
The image used is a garden withering from neglect. Very apt. Another consequence. Loss of relevance, speaking a language no one understands. What's the communication breakdown?
The world changes constantly, right? Effective communication needs to resonate now, but if a community is only talking inward,
Its language gets outdated.
its language, its cultural references, how it expresses meaning, it can all become inaccessible to outsiders. Teachings that were once relatable start sounding distant, disconnected from modern life.
Which leads to the alienation of future generations. How does that disconnect happen?
Young people, newcomers, they're looking for answers that speak to their lives, their challenges, their questions.
And if the community seems stuck,
If it seems mainly focused on internal stuff, unable to engage their concerns in a relevant way, they might feel like outsiders. They'll look elsewhere for meaning. It's a huge missed opportunity for renewal.
ironically, this inward turn, meant to strengthen identity, can actually fuel the rise of internal conflict. Why does that happen?
Well, without a clear, unifying outward mission serving the wider world, the focus inevitably turns inward.
And then?
Minor disagreements, power struggles, things that might otherwise be secondary suddenly become huge deals. Energy gets diverted from the core purpose into resolving internal fights. It weakens the whole community.
Like that isolated island analogy, full of strife. Ultimately, the source argues this leads to the advance of darkness, empowering the enemy. When that light is absent, something else fills the void.
Right. It discusses a growing stronghold, the entrenchment of falsehood. What's the core point? It's the idea that where truth and hope are scarce, deception thrives. Personal pain, societal confusion, lack of moral clarity, these create vulnerabilities.
Fertile ground.
Exactly. Fertile ground for harmful ideologies, oppressive narratives to take root and gain influence.
The illustration is stark. A neighborhood where hope is silenced, negativity takes over, leading to submission. The source also insists on the reality of spiritual warfare, a tangible conflict. What does that mean here?
It means this isn't just metaphor. The struggle between positive and negative forces is presented as real, ongoing, unchallenged lies, unaddressed despair. These are seen as actual gains for opposing forces.
So misinformation spreads easily.
In the absence of a strong, shared message of hope and truth, yes, harmful ideas take hold quickly.
It compares a believer ignoring this to an unarmed soldier and points to daily manifestations in media institutions. Then, the ripple effect societal breakdown. How does this darkness impact society?
As these negative influences spread, the moral foundations start to crack.
Like trust eroding.
Trust erodes, conflict and injustice can increase, the shared sense of right and wrong gets blurry. Without that moral compass, behaviors once unacceptable become normalized. Divisions deepen. It's a destructive cycle.
Which leads to the final point in this section. The normalization of evil. How does that gradual slide happen?
It's often subtle, which makes it dangerous. Without a strong, consistent moral framework like the gospel provides in this context, things once widely condemned can slowly become acceptable, even celebrated.
Boundaries shift.
The boundaries blur. Right and wrong become less clear. Standards slip. The source suggests looking at contemporary shifts in attitudes on certain issues as potential examples of this very process.
So the stakes in this silent war are immense. The source concludes by stressing that the stakes are eternal. A renaissance of hope is needed. It talks about the weight of inaction, consequences that transcend time. What's the ultimate impact of apathy?
The argument is that the consequences go beyond just our lifetime. Without active efforts to share hope and truth,
People stay trapped.
individuals remain stuck in despair. The vital mission of spiritual communities diminishes, and neglect creates that vacuum, allowing negative forces to advance with lasting effects.
It stresses the inescapable consequences, eternal stakes in a temporal world, highlighting the ongoing battle for souls, the legacy of inaction. But thankfully, it ends hopefully with a call to a renaissance, reclaiming the mandate of hope. What does this renaissance look like?
It's a call for renewed commitment, active engagement, reawakening that spirit of outreach with both passion and strategy.
Moving beyond just maintaining things.
Absolutely. Turning outreach into real impact through genuine relationships, culturally relevant communication, finding innovative ways to express core beliefs. It needs everyone involved, a community commitment.
It also talks about the transformative power of informed outreach, seeing every breakthrough of truth as a victory, and concludes with the eternal impact, a legacy of light. What was the final vision?
The final vision is that lives transformed by hope create a legacy that lasts. It extends into the future.
So our actions now matter later.
Deeply. By committing to outreach, to inclusivity, we become part of this living movement of redemption, of love, creating an impact that outlives us.
A really profound message to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive, drawing on a battle waged in the shadows of lostness, the stakes of spiritual neglect, profound, eternal, are pretty clear.
They certainly are.
It really leaves us with a question, doesn't it? For our own lives, our communities, are we, maybe without meaning to, adding to those shadows' lostness?
Or are we actively trying to illuminate things?
Right. With faith, with hope, with genuine connection. It's definitely something worth reflecting on personally, thinking about spiritual connection, community responsibility, individual action in our own context.